absolute pleasure to be here and see you all, at least virtually. I have been connected with YSpace for about 2 years now, and I've done a couple of presentations for them. I'm also connected to a number of other startup centers, incubators, places like that that are supporting startup businesses like yourselves. Just a little bit about HR Primed. We offer the full range and comprehensive suite of HR services, and we do provide services for startups, small business, and adjust our pricing accordingly. So that's just some shameless self-promotion on my part. The presentation I show to you today is the fundamentals, some of it legislated, some of it best practices. I know some of the things that may be on your mind given the current environment that we are in with COVID and people working remotely and the workplaces being adjusted. For the most part, I would say 98% of what I talk about today, it all still applies. Wherever you're working, the workplace is, as people are working at home, that is their workplace now. And all the same types of legislation applies. So I wanted to do a broad strokes, high level statement to speak to that, because I'm sure some of you may have some questions about that, which I'm happy to take. Okay, great. So on that note, I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works. Perfect. I said to Nafis earlier, I'm becoming a bit of a pro with Zoom presentations, and I did my first WebEx presentation today. Again, this is also part of the new norm is working virtually. And just a small comment on that. I'm a little bit older, and I just think to myself every time, if this had hit 25, 30 years ago, and we didn't have the technology we have now, we would be in far worse shape. So I keep reminding people, we're built for this now. We can do a lot of things virtually that, as I said, would not have been possible 25, 30, maybe even 20 years ago, given the technology we have. So that is a positive as far as I am concerned. So human resources for small business startups, what you need to know. So bear with me a second. So our agenda today, knowing when to get help, recruitment and selection done right, mixing up employers and contractors, record keeping and policies, informal hiring practices, measuring performance, the legislative pieces, understanding, I know it says underestimating, but understanding some of the powers that some of the legislative bodies have, as well as mismanaging staff and why you should have some level of HR support. I recognize that some of you are in different phases in terms of where you're at. Some of you may not have any employees, but I applaud you for attending this to find out what you need to know, because as you grow and add employees or more employees, you will have more HR obligations. And it's refreshing to see, for me, to see individuals, groups, companies getting ahead of the curve, because I can tell you from my experience, people often come to us when they've been in business for a number of years, and they've floated along and done well. Haven't, they've had a few HR pieces in place, but then something happens, and it's usually not a good thing. And I don't mean to be fear mongering. They come to us and seek our guidance. And it's not a judgmental comment. You only know what you know. But again, I applaud you for where you're at right now, taking that proactive approach to find out what you may need in the future and what you may need now. And again, you only know what you know. That's what I'm here for. I'm just going to reduce the size a little so you can see that. So at some point, and maybe some of you are at it now, you are crazy busy, you are running around, and all of a sudden it just hits you, I need help. I need people. And I can tell you, because I've also been in your shoes, I'm a small business owner myself. You get to that point where I can't be the CEO, the marketing manager, the janitor, the customer service person. What am I going to do? And for that, it's a milestone in the growth of your company, but it's also can be a little bit scary. You're used to doing everything by yourself, or having yourself and a couple of co-founders do everything in some cases, and it's like you're giving up a little bit of control of this baby that you have created and taken it to a level, and now you're going to that next level. The other concern is always can I really afford this? What does it look like? And later on in the presentation, we'll talk about things you can do when you're not sure if your cash flow can support having another paid person on for an extended period of time. You do have options. When you add a single employee, it fundamentally changes the nature of your business. You then have to start thinking about, do I need Workplace Safety Insurance Bureau coverage? What about payroll taxes, EI, which is employment insurance, and Canadian pension plan? These are all things that become obligations on you to track and remit on behalf of your company, as well as the employee or employees. And then, there's a whole host of other things, but that's just a short list to give you so that you get the flavor of what we're talking about, okay? So, number one, knowing when to get help. Obviously, the flip side of being too busy and working yourself to the bone is you get help too soon. And when that happens, of course, and you suddenly realize you cannot sustain that person, you're looking at letting that person go, laying them off, and with that may come some obligations that you have to provide depending on the length of service that they have with you, which again, we will talk about later. Getting help too late. This is more the scenario that I encounter when small businesses, startups come to me. Their business is suffering. They're not getting back to customers in enough time and therefore losing business. Perhaps the quality of their product is not as good as what it should be, what it was when they first started out. Perhaps they're not attracting customers at all because they've taken on a role of being a marketing manager, but really that's not an expertise they have. We can't be experts in everything. And I've had to learn that myself in terms of having to bring on the people that are experts that can drive your business to that level and scale up. And your own health. And one of the things that in a lot of the mentorship groups that am a part of with the innovation centers or the incubators, is we often tell young CEOs, new CEOs, new presidents, new founders, watch your health. Don't burn yourself out. You can flame out really quickly if you're not taking care of yourself. And that's always important to keep in mind. I know that there's a passion to being an entrepreneur. There is a drive, there is a persistence, there is a desire, but at some point you may fall flat, and you definitely want to avoid that. We may find ourselves in a situation where our growth is so incremental that you just hire out of stress or desperation. So it may be, hey, do you know somebody? And you just bring them on board. And there should ideally be a process to go through to make sure that when you are hiring somebody, they are the right person for the job, because that's where some places may find them in trouble. Some of this may not happen. So you may be able to fly by the seat of your pants, and good things come of it, and that's great. But these are definitely some of the potential pitfalls that could happen when you are looking to hire people, or you've hired too early. Okay. So 13 flags you need to hire. Sorry, just got. You're turning down work. Some may say that that's a good thing if you're so busy you can turn down work. I don't share that same sense of obligation. I think that if once you turn down work, you may have lost a customer for life, a client for life, someone that you may have needed down the road when work was a little bit drier. So you've identified new sources of potential revenue streams. And again, you're going to need people to address that new potential stream. It goes back to what I was saying about you cannot do it all on your own. I'm just taking a look here to see if there's any questions. New sources, or sorry, your customers are complaining. As a new company, a startup company, a small company, no company can afford that, but you are in a more vulnerable place because you don't have you may not have the resources to address those complaints. And again, once you lose customers, they're highly unlikely to come back. One bad experience, and they may never come back again. And they may be giving you the opportunity because they want to support small business. They want to support startups. And if you can't deliver to the satisfaction of what they would get to a larger provider, again, you may lose them for life. Okay. As I mentioned, your quality of your products are suffering. So if you can't give that full attention to a product or service to be top-notch and are delivering mediocre or poor, again, that's when you get into losing business. And some customers may not even tell you that they weren't satisfied. They'll just simply stop communicating. They'll, what I like to term, they'll ghost you. And some people are not good with conflict, confrontation, and you may find out that they didn't like what you did or offered, or they were dissatisfied with your service through somebody else. The worst situation you want to be in is to hear from somebody else who is looking at you to provide them a product or service, and they say, well, I heard. You know, that can be, again, you're more vulnerable as a smaller business when that happens. The daily financials, bookkeeping, paperwork, the administration, all that stuff that is a killer, that can suck a lot of time, but it's absolutely necessary. Sometimes it is legislatively required, and you don't want any of the legislative bodies, the government legislative bodies, be it CRA, Ministry of Labor, you don't want them on your doorstep or coming after you because they will pursue. Okay, you need someone with a specific skill set. You identify, this isn't something, this is way outside of my expertise. And in order to, to take that, whatever it is, again, for instance, if it's a marketing manager, if you want to take your marketing to a whole new ball game, it's best to get that person with that expertise that knows. Again, this goes down to burnout, not finding any time for a break or vacation. You need your downtime, okay? Recognizing that passion of an entrepreneur, we all need a break once in a while, okay? If your company isn't growing, and it could be related to all of these reasons, that may be another flag, okay? If your customers are saying, I've been trying to get a hold of you, and your return time is poor, your time to get back to me or quote on a job is just too long, again, could be another red flag. You can finally afford it. I got money in the bank. It's time to hire somebody. And I recognize, again, and we're going to talk about this, some of you may be using freelancers or what I call independent contractors, using them for a specified period of time. Maybe, you know, if you're looking at needing 2 or 3 freelancers, maybe that's the work of 1 full-time employee. And you have enough work, of course, to keep busy. And maybe you're eventually planning to sell your company. Could be another reason that why you need employees, is, you know, whoever's looking at you may wish that you had a couple of employees. There's probably a few more that I haven't hit on, but again, you will, if you experience any of these, it's time to start asking the questions, okay? Bear with me a second. So what are some recruitment best practices? We've come to this conclusion based on some of these 13 reasons, or maybe some other reasons where we've decided we need to hire somebody. So the first thing you should do is, as a best practice, is what are we hiring? What's the role? And more importantly, what are they going to do? So that's where a job description comes in. There are several ways you can do job descriptions. I've seen all sorts of ways. Some of the best practices I can offer you, with some, you know, that with templates that are out there, are it has to include the duties and responsibilities, and it has to include the skills, experience, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes which the person needs to do this job. Okay, you can develop this on your own. You can use other resources. And as I will say throughout this, you can leverage an HR expert to help you with that. But it is important, this job description is important because it is, it gives you a guide on how you're gonna post for this job, and it will be something that you can utilize with the employee to say, this is what you're gonna be doing for your job. And a key piece of that job description is what are the outcomes of their work, their key performance indicators. And it is better to be able to explain that with a job description than just, you know, pulling it out of thin air. And, you know, there's a lot of companies out there that do this and they don't have a job description. And that makes them vulnerable, because if they are, if someone signs up for a job and the verbal understanding was one thing, but it turns out to be another, there could be some consequences to that in terms of litigation-wise, as well as the person may just decide, well, I didn't sign up for this, I'm quitting. So your turnover may quit. When you have an understanding with the employee of what they're actually meant to be doing, how they're going to be assessed on their performance, you're in a much better spot, okay? Where to look for candidates. And again, knowing startups, small business, you don't have deep pockets, some of you, to be posting on some of these websites like, you know, LinkedIn. I think it's around $400 or $500 to do a posting. They do a daily rate based on traffic and volume. Workopolis, they still exist. Their rate is roughly about the same. So what are some resources out there that you can utilize to get candidates that are low cost or no cost? Everyone's go-to, of course, is Indeed, because you can post for free there. And then if you want a few bells and whistles, you have to pay for them. Depending on the job, there may be website specific sites that you can post. Some post for free. I've found associations and if the job is a regulated profession, they sometimes offer free posting. The other thing, but I'm going to caution with this, word of mouth. So if you know people in the specific industry that you're looking for a person, you can ask them if they know of anybody. Leverage your network, okay? What I don't mean by that is just because your buddy, your friend, is a great person, good at their job. If they refer someone, don't just hire that person on the spot. Make them go through the process. And that's, again, I know in the interest of time, some of you may want an expedited recruitment and selection process. Some people do hire based on a 15-minute meet and greet. If it works, that's great. But my experience has been that it doesn't always work. So there should be a structured process to this, with people submitting resumes, looking at the resumes, and having pre-screen interviews on the phone to make sure they meet basic qualifications, and then having them in for structured interview questions. So that means if you're interviewing more than one person, everybody gets answered the same question, and you're able to assess everybody fairly and accurately to see who's the right fit for the job. Another piece that sometimes is overlooked is references. References are important, okay? If you're hiring people that don't have a lot of working experience, because generally the call is for 3 references, 2 of which must be been in a supervisory capacity over the person. A third as a peer, but who's in a supervisory capacity now, would be ideal. But again, sometimes you're dealing with people that don't have a lot of work experience, so they may have 1 or 2 references. That's okay to do given the experience that they have. And your references should be very comprehensive. You want to make sure that you're bringing the right person into the job, that they are going to fit in with your environment, fit in with sometimes what is the chaotic and agile nature of a startup, and be able to roll with that, okay? And you should have structured reference questions as well to ask people. Generally, I would suggest and recommend reference questions that are where the person has to provide examples, okay? So if one of your things to look at is how did a person handle conflict in the workplace? Ask them to give you an example, okay? And you also want to ask things like what were their duties and responsibilities, to give you a flavor of if what they did at their past job is a fit or transferable to the position you're hiring them for. So you do all this, you do your background checks, and there are other types of background checks, but for now, as a fundamental, references are a must. You get to the point of an employment contract. And this is where sometimes I get the call that a client has let somebody go and now they've got some litigation. And again, I'm not trying to do fear mongering or anything like that. I'm just giving, real life situations. And when I look at their employment contract, it's not robust. And you need an employment contract that spells out the exact working conditions, what they're getting in for their pay. There's a lot of pieces to it. I know from my experience, a few people that are now clients, they went online to Google, they found something and they used it. And that's not always an appropriate fit for what they need it for. Generally, the employment contracts I have, depending if they are a frontline position, they're about 5 pages long, and it spells out every piece of the working relationship. It protects the employee, and more importantly, it protects you, because this is the understanding that you have of what the working conditions are going to be, okay? The probation, and by the way, folks, there sometimes people have become clients, they've hired people, and they didn't have an employment contract, which makes them very vulnerable, because everything is then based on who said what and what was promised, okay? That's not a good position to be in. Your probationary period. There is nothing in legislation that says you have to have a probationary period, nor how long it should be, but you should have one. The the reason you need a probationary period is to give you time to assess if the person you've hired is a fit with your organization, both with the skill set required and also the culture and values of your organization. If any of you are familiar with probationary periods, you've probably heard, most likely it's been a 3-month probationary period. That is there, and yes, a number of organizations, companies do use that. But the reason that is there is because for some companies that are advanced in their growth, they're able to offer benefits. And at the 3-month period is when you generally are providing benefits to a person. So some places will put 3 months as a probationary period for that purpose. The other reason is when you let somebody go without cause, so you have no reason to let them go other than they're not a fit or there's a layoff or downsizing, you are obligated to give what's called pay in lieu of notice. And it's 1 week for every year of service up to a maximum of 8 years. That kicks in after 3 months. So some people are stuck on having a 3-month probationary period for that reason. If they don't work out before 3 months, I don't have to pay them anything, and I can use the probationary period as my discretionary period to let them go. I always recommend folks at least a 6-month probationary period. There are some places out there that have year-long probationary periods, and some even have a 2-year probationary period. And there's nothing wrong with any of them. But at 3 months, for me, I think the person's just getting wet behind the ears when they are starting a new job. And I think they're not what's the word? They're not knee deep in it as they would be if a longer period of time. I'm actually now suggesting to some employees or some employers that perhaps a 9-month probationary period is what they need. And these are for places that have had higher turnover. The only difference between the 6 and the 9 and the 3-month is you have to give them a week's pay in lieu of notice. So from my perspective, that's a small price to pay to ensure you've got the right person. And you have a lot of leeway, a lot of discretion in the probationary period. That doesn't mean don't tell them when they're doing something wrong. One of the pieces with a probationary period is you must make an attempt, you must tell the person give them the feedback when they're not working, if they're not working out or doing something wrong, or and give them an opportunity to correct it. So that has to be in place. Where to find employees, I've already covered that off in where to look for candidates in terms of potential avenues that are free. I find I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn. You can utilize those two just on your profile, put up there that you're looking for somebody. And on Facebook, I'm told Facebook is not so popular these days. I have 2 teenage kids. They tell me only old people are on that. So that for me is still an avenue to seek out new employees. There's a number of business groups on Facebook that I'm a part of, and I will put out postings for that for my clients, and I've had some good success with that. And again, that's freebie stuff that you can use. One thing to keep in mind when you're recruiting candidates, pre-COVID, it was a pretty tight labor market. It was really difficult to find talent, and then even tougher to find good talent. So candidates kind of had the pick of the litter when it came to choosing jobs. So just as much as you're sizing them up to see if they will work for you, they're sizing you up to see if they want to work for you. Okay? They want to know if you're credible. Do you have all your ducks in a row? How you treat them or how they feel they're treated in this recruitment process for them will be very telling as to whether they join your organization or not. So keep that in mind, that it's not just them marketing and providing PR to you. You're marketing and providing PR to them about the benefits of coming to work for you and what you can offer. So always maintain professionalism in this, as you're going through this process. The right fit. And this is something I wanted to talk about. You can have somebody, and again, this comes from a few years of experience, you can have somebody with all the right qualifications, the right background, achieved a lot, but are they going to fit with your environment? And I think this is really important for you folks in the startup and small business segment, because you may be looking at people that have come from much larger organizations that are used to a few comforts that at this point in your growth, you can't provide. And, you know, earlier I made that comment about sometimes the chaos and the ability to be agile in a startup environment, because you may be going on one path and then you have to take another. I'm sure a few of you know what I mean. And I've been there myself, working with some of these small companies that I work with, and they've had to shift gears. So you really need to ensure that they're a fit with that type of environment. They're a fit with your values, your ethics. For some people that are looking for a new challenge, the nature, the novelty, if you will, of a startup, of a place that is going to go places, and it's going to take off, and it's a journey, and it's a fresh journey, and we get to develop. It all sounds lovely in the beginning, but when they try to hit the ground with it, they may find that it's really not for them. And that's not a criticism. That's just, it's not their way of doing business. It's not their way of working. They just may not be a fit. So you have to ask the questions in your recruitment process to ascertain if they feel that that is a fit. And I hope that sounds rational to most people. Again, in my experience, that has particularly happened where a startup or a small business has taken on somebody and they're just not prepared to, they don't like change. They thought this would be okay in terms of change, but it's just too much for them. It's just not the environment for them. And, if they come to that conclusion fairly quickly, you part ways, no acrimony, it just wasn't a fit. The other thing to keep in mind is, as I'm sure most of you know, and I certainly do, and some of you are probably still experiencing that, you do wear a lot of hats when you're a startup in a small business. And you may be asking your employees to wear a few hats as well. Again, my experience, most people that come in, they can do that, no problem. But there are some that, yes, they think that they can do it, that it'll be a great new experience. And in fact, they may just get overwhelmed with it. So again, just ensure that when you are asking these questions, to ensure that they are aware of the environment that they're coming into with a startup or small business. When you have done your post-hire, so you've got your employment contract signed, you got your brand spanking new employee, the foundation of any future success is a solid orientation to the company. And it may be, depending on where all of you are in your growth of your organization, it may just be a couple of hours. It may even be an hour. Some of the spaces you're working in may be quite small, but you do need to give that orientation. And what I mean by orientation is sitting down with the person, again, reviewing their job description, reviewing your health and safety, your policies and procedures, and any health and safety policies that you have, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. And just about, here's what you do if you need something. So if you need to order supplies, this is the process you go through. Some companies I've worked with, and again, these are much larger organizations, they have employee handbooks. So it's a handy guide for employees to have, that if they have a question about how do I order supplies, What do I do if I have an IT problem? Things of that nature, then it's right there for them. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're, and I should have said this at the beginning, the things I talk about in terms of best practices, it doesn't matter if you're a startup, small business, medium size, large size, the IBM of the world, all of these best practices apply, and they can all be made to fit your circumstances, with very, very, very few exceptions, okay? Some of the legislative pieces that we will get into, that is somewhat dependent on your employee size, and again, we'll get into that a little bit later, okay? When I have that point there about feedback, that's to do with the probationary period. So as I've said, the probationary period gives you a wide berth in terms of letting somebody go during this period, and with no, no obligations that you would have were they pass their probationary period. So it is important that you provide feedback on a pretty consistent basis to somebody during this probationary period. If there are problems or issues, or things come up, you need to address it rather quickly and not let it fester. I always, from my standpoint, I think at the end of the first day, the end of the first week, the end of the first 30 days, and then every 30 days thereafter, you should be doing some sort of formal kind of sit down with the new employee to let them know, and also giving them the opportunity to adjust their performance if it is an issue, okay? Also, think about it from the new employee's perspective. It's a little bit nerve-wracking for some people coming into a new job, and they want to know how they're doing so that they can feel a little bit more at ease. I've worked with companies over the years where their philosophy, mentality, their attitude is, well, if you don't hear anything from me, just assume you're doing a good job. So to me, that's not the method I would recommend you take, for a couple of reasons. Number one, so you're only going to talk to me if I screw up. What kind of a message is that to your employee? Not exactly one of feeling value. And again, just as much as employees it needs to be addressed when they've made a mistake. They also need to be recognized for good performance as well. This is a little bit beyond the scope of a fundamentals presentation, but in employee engagement surveys and exit interviews, the number one reason that employees leave organizations is they don't feel valued. And by that, it's a simple thank you goes a long way. And I can tell you, working in this remote environment that we're at, we need to be saying thank you a hell of a lot more right now, because they're, again, I'll just go off on a little bit of a COVID thing right now. We're starting to see some trends emerging after 6 or 7 weeks of being in isolation and people working remotely. And that's both positively and not so positive, but it's the positive ones, of course, that we're concerned about. And one of the ones is people's mental health. So the constant communication with employees is necessary in this time, and making sure they know that they're feeling valued. Okay, so that was just a little sidebar as I think of these things. And again, I'll address those types of questions at the end of the presentation. So this is about employee classification. And this goes back, I'll go back to this point about when you are at that point where you think you need some extra help, but you may be not sure for how long, and you may not be able, try this again. Sorry, you may not know how long you need them, and what type of working relationship it is. So there are many ways you can address that. And the best way to address this is the employee classifications. So we have the full-time classification. that's generally considered to be, you know, anywhere between 40 hours a week. And sometimes it comes with benefits. Some of you may or may not be there at this point with benefits. They're considered permanent, all the rights of a permanent employee. Part-time, that can be that can be anything less than 40 hours, or what is considered full-time in the organization. Okay. They may have set hours. Their hours, it may be that their hours are as needed, but they do have some steady hours coming in. It can be a contract, and a contract employee, and this is important when we get into this discussion between contract employee versus independent contractor. A contract employee is someone who is hired for a specific period of time for a job. So I'll use the example of a maternity leave. Typically, people take a year, so the person is hired on a year basis. That is put in the employment contract that it is a year basis. Once the period is up, there can be, if there's no more job or no more work for them after that, then they're done. And there's no severance obligations, there's no pay in lieu of notice. You were hired for that specific period of time to do a certain job, and our obligations with the employee-employer relationship is done. Okay, that's also good if you think you have some work that is going to be there for 3 months, 6 months, a year, and you hire someone for that period of time. And even if you are anticipating it's going to be a year, a question some of you might have is, what if the work is done in less than a year? Well, with that all-important employment contract, you would put in there that you have the right to terminate the contract with advance notice for any reason. And that could be the work gets done quicker. Okay. And again, going back to the employment contracts, with these employee classifications, that's something you definitely want to spell out in the contract as to what type of arrangement is this? What type of classification do we have? Is this someone with full-time permanent benefits? Is this someone who's part-time but no guaranteed hours? Or do we have guaranteed hours? So those are things you need to keep in mind as well when we're talking about employee classifications. Temporary employee, again, you hire them for as needed. You may not know the amount of time that you need them for. So again, the arrangement would be in writing. You will work until you're no longer required. Okay. And then the casual employee, someone who is available when you need them. There's no guarantee of hours, but if you get busy enough and they have the skill set, you will call them to come in and work for you. So this addresses some of the questions around, what if my work processes, or sorry, my products or services are in a cycle and they ebb and flow. I'll use the automotive industry as an example here, where they many years ago came to the conclusion that they couldn't sustain their full-time workforces as they were. And so a lot of their jobs went to temporary, seasonal, it's what we call just-in-time staffing. And for the temporary or the casual employees, some employers may use a temporary staffing agency, which has its pros and cons, and that again is for another discussion, but it's certainly something that is available to you when you don't know just how long you're going to need somebody, or you need somebody quickly. And these temporary staffing agencies should have already done the upfront work in terms of assessing these people and ensuring that they're a fit with what you want. Okay. And then I wanted to talk, so independent contractors versus contractors versus employees. And that should say independent contractors, not so as I've said, contract employees, they're an employee. They are maybe there for a defined period of time, but they are an employee. They get deductions from their, you pay them, you are responsible for their deductions, you are responsible for their WSIB remittances. You have their social insurance number, and they are subject to your policies and working conditions. Okay. Independent contractors, and that is the same with all the classifications of employees: full-time, part-time, temporary, casual. If they're on your books, they are an employee. So that means all of these things on the right-hand side of the screen, that is what that is some of the terms and what you are obligated to do and provide for them, and what they're obligated to provide to you as someone who is getting directly paid by them. Okay. A independent contractor, that's someone like myself. So I don't work for you. I'm not on your books. Excuse me. We've come to an arrangement that you need some HR services in your organization, whether it be for day-to-day or to build HR infrastructure. So we have a contract, and it's not an employment contract, it's a business contract. We've decided what you want me to deliver to you, how much is going to be paid, how the invoices are going to be paid, the scope of work, what you expect in the delivery of that work. And as I do work, I invoice you for that. I am not covered by the Employment Standards Act, which we will talk about under legislation. I have to use my own tools, my own resources. I have to be available to you, but I am not exclusive to you. I have other clients that I can use. It even comes down to the point that independent contractors should not be partaking in company events like Christmas parties or anything like that. In recent years, the Ministry of Labor, the Employment Standards people have really come down hard and have been much more proactive in looking at whether people that are associated with an organization are independent contractors, some of you may call them freelancers, or are they actually employees? And there is a 5-point litmus test they look at, which is based on some of these things that you see here, to determine if in fact the person is an independent contractor or an employee. Obviously, if you have somebody who you classify as an independent contractor, you don't have to pay any CPP, any EI, the employer side of it. You don't have to worry about their WSIB coverage. However, again, if it looks like an employee, walks like an employee, it is an employee. So you need to be very careful if this is something you are considering doing as part of your desire and requirements to meet some staffing needs. I'll give you an example. A client of mine from a while ago, part of the thing they look at is, are these jobs that you have as people do classified as an independent contractor, are they a core element of your business? So this one client from a while ago, he was in a travel related business, and he put all his, what were essentially salespeople, in an independent contractor role. In fact, those salespeople were an integral part to his business for what they were doing. And he got hit. The Canada Revenue Agency came after him and said that they had been misclassified, and he had to pay back quite a bit of money in terms of payroll taxes for these people, EI, things of that nature. Are they out there, do they catch everybody? No, they don't. And some people are still prepared to have people classified as independent contractors and take that chance. And you know, that is up to them. When I am asked about this, I give my best advice, guidance, and counsel, let them know what some of the potential consequences are, and then it is up to them whether they move forward with this or move them to being classified as employees. I hope I'm not moving too fast, and again, if we need to take a break, that's fine, because I could keep talking all night long. Just looking in the chat. So there's a question here. Do you recommend probation periods for independent contractors as well? So I'll address that one first. Again, just keep in mind, independent contractors are not your employees. So they really don't have, they shouldn't be given a probationary period. What I would say is that, you know, you actually have a lot more flexibility and leeway with independent contractors, because if they are not giving you the products and services that you need, they're not delivering the scope of work or the expectations, you can just terminate that contract. In any independent contractor agreement, which is also something that a lot of us HR consultants do as well, is draw up those types of agreements. There's always something built in about being able to terminate the contract with appropriate notice for any reason. So that's something that if you are entertaining the idea of independent contractors, that is something that you should have in the agreement, okay? The other part of that question was, do they need pay in lieu of notice or severance as well? Again, those are employee obligations that you don't need to give to independent contractors, okay? Again, it goes back to that built-in piece about terminating the contract if they're not providing the work in a standard that is acceptable to you, okay? You terminate with a couple of weeks notice or immediately. And also in that independent contractor agreement, you need to adequately and concretely define what the outcome of their work is expected to be. Just as you would in an employment contract, you can't use vague wording, or you shouldn't use vague wording. You need to use concrete statements so that there is no ambiguity, and that extends to independent contractor agreements as well, okay? Another question here, which is an awesome question, because I also work with this type of relationship, and I should have put it in there as well. This question is around volunteers. And I have provided consulting services to organizations that, in fact, have had volunteers. So, with few exceptions, volunteers are subject to the same type of parameters as employees do. I would say one of the few differences is with an employee or with a volunteer, there is a threshold of decision making that they don't exercise that they would have if they were a volunteer. If they were an employee. So employees are able to make decisions in their capacity that a volunteer wouldn't make. And again, for volunteers, they need to have job descriptions. They need to know what the scope of their activities are, what are their duties and responsibilities, who their reporting relationship is. Again, we're going to talk about performance management. Same thing. They need to have performance management. In fact, in organizations where I have, had to work with volunteers, they've welcomed performance management. A lot of people may volunteer because they're looking for work experience. So if they can get a performance appraisal that shows that they're doing a great job, that's something that they can take to a potential employee. So again, I'll just very high level with volunteers, for the most part, few exceptions, the same types of things apply. You have to give the same mandatory training. You have to give, they are subject to the same type of health and safety parameters, and they are subject to the same type of policies and procedures, okay? And when we say volunteer, we typically may not think that we should be interviewing them, but you should. Again, subject to the same types of thing. You're letting this person in your organization, and anybody that comes into your organization needs to be a fit. And for some of you with volunteers, they may be dealing with vulnerable people. So you also need to know that they are not going to, they're not going to be that they're not going to harm or be a concern around these vulnerable people. So, okay. Sorry, just give me a second here. So we talked about that. So I think we've covered off the difference between contractor, independent contractor, and employee. Again, if it's not clear, feel free to, I'm hitting you with a lot of information right now. It's going to be hard to digest. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to provide my contact information. So if you need any clarification on this, don't hesitate to reach out. So informal hiring practices, and what I'm talking about when I get to this piece is I've talked about having a structured recruitment and selection process, having people submit resumes and cover letters, doing a pre-screening process, having structured interview questions, doing reference checks, and going through those things to make sure that the person meets your needs. Sometimes, you know, we're in a rush to hire people. We feel like we've just got to get what I call cheeks and seats or warm bodies. So sometimes we will, you know, and I've certainly experienced this in my working career. Owners, founders, they put out a SOS to their employees and friends and co-workers, and say, do you know anybody? Are they reliable? They just hire them based on that. Again, I've talked about that. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink. Thank you. I've talked about that, you know, in some cases it works out, which is great. But in some cases, what if it doesn't work out? What if they are not the rock star that your friend, your family member has said that they are, and you need to get rid of them? You've wasted all that period of time training, and then even outside of the employment thing, there could be some bad feelings between you and the person they came through, which is something a little added to the negativity of the situation, which is unfortunate. So I'm not saying don't hire friends, family, friends of friends, but have them go through the process. There's nothing wrong with nepotism if the process is followed. It's transparent, it's fair, and everybody gets treated equally, okay? Again, we talk about not having that job description. How do people know what they're doing? Where is that document that they can go back to and say, this was my understanding of what the job is? If you're making it up as you go, in some cases, yeah, it might work, and they may, the people may be able to roll with it. But some people need that structure, and if they feel they're doing things that they are not qualified for or they were not hired for, they may push back. And again, the formal job description helps you take a look at, what am I looking for in an employee? So it's of a great benefit to you. I should also say that a job description It comes from a process that is the cornerstone of everything we do in human resources. It's called job analysis. And it's the reason that it's the cornerstone of everything we do, it is because it is the legally defensible mechanism we have when should a person challenge the job that they do and aspects of the job that they do. So a job analysis process gives us all of the information we need about how to compensate that person, what training they need, what the actual job looks like, what performance looks like, how we will recruit them. So that's another reason why you may want to look at these things. Again, the unstructured job interview, you're not assessing people in the same manner. And if you're just making up questions off the top of your head, you're not going to get the ability in most cases to adequately compare and contrast employees and make a decision whether who's going to fit for the position. So there's a lot of this is there's risks of litigation. There's also risks of losing out on other qualified candidates. You may also, if you are somebody that already has a few employees, the other employees may get a little bit ticked off if this happens more than once, because then the extra work is on them, and they may become disenfranchised and look to leave. So you will find that if you have a structured process, you're probably more likely to keep employees in the long term and good employees in the long term as well. Record keeping, and I see a couple more questions which I'm going to ask here. Student internship, and I'm going to assume that is being asked in the same vein as volunteers, and my answer is the same. Student interns, although there's different kind of expectations of performance because they're in a learning role, they are subject to the same things as employees. Same policies and procedures, same health and safety conditions, need to do the same mandatory trainings. Definitely performance is a part of it, but it's going to be based on where they're at as a student. And again, I've implemented these types of things at some of my clients where they do have students. And again, the students appreciate that formal structure because it gives them something tangible to take with them after they've done their internship to say to any potential employers, this is what I achieved when I was on my internship. So I hope that answers. If I'm not answering your questions as you would like, just let me know. I'm happy to dive a little bit deeper. Next question is about would it be better to just take on independent contractors? And there's a few. The main piece is taking on independent contractors. Probably from a cost perspective, if all companies could take on independent contractors, they probably, the question is specific to small to medium size taking on independent contractors. So from a cost perspective, it might be more cost efficient for the employer, no doubt about it. However, again, I go back to that there is a litmus test for independent contractor versus employees. And it is such things as, are they using company resources? Is the work an integral piece of the company business? And then there's a few other things as well. Exclusivity is another one. If you're expecting this person to be there 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, that's an employee. That's not an independent contractor. So independent contractors don't have the same constraints as an employee. They are free to work for other people. They can't have a company email. They take care of their own remittances for CPP, EI. They take care of their own mandatory deductions. Again, they are separate from your organization. So And as there's the other piece to the comment that was posed was about having so many pitfalls to having employees. It sounds like a lot, and again, this is something I should have said at the beginning. It sounds cumbersome, it sounds overwhelming, but once you do this a few times, and again, with the guidance of people that know this stuff, it becomes very, very routine is the word I'm looking for. And again, if you follow all of the best practices and are compliant, this just becomes second nature, okay? So I don't want to make it sound like you shouldn't have employees, because at some point you're definitely going to have to consider it depending on what your goals and objectives are and how you scale. But initially it might seem like a lot of work when you're taking on your first couple of employees, but after that it becomes routine, okay? And thank you for the compliment of well answered. So record keeping and policies and procedures. So way back when I was in HR boot camp, one of the first things that they said and that they kept repeating to us through HR boot camp was the 3 golden rules of HR are document, document, document. And that doesn't just apply to HR. That's also what we try to instill in the people we're working with, whether it be managers, whether it be owners, whether it be founders. You are going to have, you are going to be more protected and have less hassle if you document everything you're supposed to. So when you do your mandatory training, record it. When you do your reference checks, record it. When you, oh, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. When you do your health and safety training, record it. When people have reviewed policies and procedures on a yearly basis like they should have, record it. That is going to be your biggest backup if things should be come into question with a particular employee. And it's the same with performance. If you need people to, if you're looking at somebody's performance and seeing that it is not up to standard, do you have the backup to say you're not performing as we need to? And I'm not saying that means automatically terminating them. You may do something like a performance improvement plan. And again, my experience in some cases has been, I get a call from a prospective client that says, we have an employee, they've been here a long time, and they're not doing the job that they were doing a few years ago, and we'd like to get rid of them. And I ask about their performance reviews, and there either is no performance review, or the one they've done, if they're telling me that this person is a bad employee, well, that's not represented on record. They look really, in some cases, like a rock star on record. So you have to be accurate, and you have to be direct, and you have to have these conversations, which for some people are not very easy when you're talking about someone's performance, okay? And there's a whole bunch of strategies around that are out there when you have to have those conversations. So it is imperative that you keep employee files with all of this documentation. They can be paper files. They can also be electronic files as well. There should be some sort of backup mechanism, because records, and that includes things like payroll records, they need to be kept for up to 7 years. And after 7 years, you can purge that information. Okay, that is the standard. So organizing paper folders, again, electronically, even though we're in the electronic age and we were told this is going to cut down on paper, HR is still killing a forest a day, I can tell you that, because we keep a lot of our stuff in paper file as well as electronic. So you've got to keep those files up to date, and once a year, it's not a bad idea, and it's difficult when you get to be a larger organization, but some still do it. They do file audits and go through them to make sure that there's no unnecessary information in there, and that everything that should be in there is in there, okay? Employment contracts, because again, if you may need to refer to them at some point, and you need to have a copy of that somewhere. Any kind of disciplinary action, any kind of positive performance evaluation as well. And I try to make sure that there's a balance between what could go wrong and some of the positive things of having all this is well represented. And as much as there might be, you know, disciplinary notes in there, you may also have a commendation letter from a client or a customer that said this person went above and beyond. And that's something to keep in there as well, okay? Policies and procedures. And again, not knowing where a lot of you are in terms of your growth or your startup, I would say as soon as you get that first employee, and maybe even in advance of that first employee, start looking at policies and procedures. Again, my experience has been with some organizations is they think in the moment that we don't need these right now, we're too small, and we'll get to it when we grow, and then it gets forgotten. And before you know it, they have a lot more employees, and there's a lot more things going on that they realize they need some structure around. So then it's playing a little bit of catch up. Policies and procedures are important because it sets the groundwork for conduct in the workplace, for expectations, for procedures on what to do if things happen. And again, it's a living document. There is always something that is being added, amended within a policies and procedures. And again, it is something you fall back on when you have to point to some sort of employee conduct, and you point out that this is written in their in your policies and procedures. There are some standard pieces which are needed across all companies, but then there's also the nuances to different organizations. So of course, these policies and procedures have to fit the circumstances of the employer as well. Again, if it's not written, it doesn't exist. And to say that something may not be up to speed with an expectation in policies and procedures, but it's not written there, it's not going to go far if it's challenged. So this is something that needs to be remain current and accurate. And again, when you're first starting out, your policies and procedures, if it's only 5 pages long because that's all you need, then that's all you need. And maybe that 5 pages will be something that you can use for a period of time. It's always good to be ensuring that you take a look at this at least once a year so that you know that your policies and procedures are up to date. And a lot of these policies and procedures are related to the legislation that's out there. So for instance, leaves of absence or workplace violence and harassment, these are things that need to be represented in your policies and procedures as well. So, and again, it's reasonable policies and procedures. You don't want to go overboard and have things in there that really don't apply to your workplace either. So it's a fine balance, and all of this that I'm talking about is a fine balancing act between being able to get the best, the most productive employees, the rock stars, and keeping them as well. Getting them in the door is one thing. Being able to keep them is another, because on average, you get an employee today, they'll probably stay with you on average 3 to 5 years. If you can buck that average, then you're doing something right in terms of, you know, some of your HR policies and procedures and processes. there is comfort in having this structure for employees, and because they know their backs are covered, and they know that their employer is on top of things as well. You know, that's another reason that you need this. Is it is an employee retention tool for sure. Oh, measuring performance. And again, I go back to the job description. And one of the key things that you need to point out there is, what are the outcomes that are expected? What are some of the key performance indicators that you need to see in order to say person is doing a okay job, a good job, a great job, and then maybe in some cases not a great job? And that could be a results type of thing, so a quantifiable output that you're expecting. It could be a behavior type thing, in terms of, you know, something like communication, or it could be a trait type thing, in terms of, you know, always approachable or something like that. Whatever it is, it needs to be part of your assessment tool. And again, I have had experiences, small, medium, large organizations, where people have never had any type of performance type mechanism. So they just assume that they're doing a good job. I've been here for 10 or 20 years. But it helps with many different types of elements in the workplace. I do want to differentiate, though, between a couple of things. Performance management versus performance evaluation or performance appraisal. Your performance management is a system that is always ongoing. It is your way of recognizing good performance, rewarding good performance, and it could be a daily thing. It could be, excuse me, as I said to you, those simple thank yous. For those people that go above and beyond and stay and get work done because it's critical that it gets out, and you give them a $50 gift certificate for going above and beyond. That is all part of your performance management system. It also includes addressing when performance is not up to standard, and the options and mechanisms you have there to support people so that their performance does improve. Performance evaluation or performance appraisal, that is the typical once a year, because most organizations have a formal once a year sit down to evaluate the person's performance over the past year. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we're clear on the difference between that. But your performance management system can help you in so many ways. It can, you know, for those employees that are doing a great rock star job as opposed to a good or okay job, you can use that to as a basis and provide a rationale for why they get an increase in compensation or a bonus. It can also, for those employees that are maybe struggling or need some improvement somewhere, you can identify what's needed to improve their performance. And it helps you identify your key talent. Who are these people that are, you know, the shining stars that we are looking to that could be future leaders in our company? No matter how small we are, could they take on a much more robust role with more responsibility and skills? So it's a good indicator for that as well. I know a couple of big organizations, Accenture and Toys R Us are two of them. They've just abandoned performance appraisals, any type of performance system altogether. They said it was cumbersome, it was proved of little worth, and I have to say I don't think that was the right move on their part. I know, when I worked in HR departments, managers in some instances did not like performance management systems or performance evaluation systems because they didn't feel it was well explained. They didn't think they were well equipped to be able to assess people's performance. Excuse me. So what that comes down to is when you're implementing these things, is to make sure that everybody's got a solid understanding of why we need it, what we're using it for, and what kind of things can happen from this, and supporting those that are providing and managing this system so that they feel strong enough and confident enough in doing what they need to do to reward good behavior, reward good performance, I should say, and then address where people need performance improvement as well. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to take a drink here. So we get into some of the legal aspects of this. So as an employer here in Ontario, you have these 5 different types of frameworks. And again, I'm going to give a high-level overview of some of them. I'm going to go into the Employment Standards Act a little bit deeper because I think for the size of some of your organizations, this is going to be the most relevant for you. So the Ontario Human Rights Act, it's administered by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. It doesn't just address human rights and discrimination in the employment world, but it also addresses human rights in support services, housing, and a couple of other areas that I can't recall at this time. But it is within the employment world where they receive the bulk of their complaints. And the last statistic I saw was that 80% of human rights complaints are related to something in the workplace, something in the employment. And the bulk of that comes in the component of recruitment. So people saying, I did not get an interview because, I did not get the job because. There are 18 prohibited grounds. I'm not going to go through all of them. There is a website that you can, that I think I provided at the end of this, that you can take a look at it. Some of them are more obvious than others. There may be a few surprises for you in terms of, oh, I didn't know that that was a prohibited ground. And again, no judgment, that you only know what you know. Just if I had more time, I would highlight a few that may not be as well known as others. But it is important that you structure your decisions so that they are not infringing on these 18 prohibited grounds. And because there are sometimes, some things occur where people put, a job posting out, or they put something in a job description, or they put something in a policy, and they think that, that's okay to have. They don't have any intention of maliciously discriminating against a certain class of people. But in fact, it is discriminatory against a certain segment of people, and therefore, it's in violation of that. Usually when that happens, it's an education piece. Here's why you can't have it. Here's the impact of it. If it is impacting a certain segment of society from being considered for a job, say, then you can't have it in there. Okay, so as I said, it's administered by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. This is probably, I know from an HR perspective, this is a piece of legislation I deal with predominantly. Okay, again, I know this is pretty obvious, but we are in a very multicultural and diverse environment in Ontario, and especially in the Toronto, GTA, York area. So it is important to know some things may not be known up front about different expectations of a religion, different expectations of a culture, but you may have a duty to what we call accommodate those. And so if you get a request for accommodation that may seem like you may think, I don't have to approve that, make sure you ask a few questions before you say no, okay? Because I've definitely had that happened where an employer, not being malicious, they just didn't think that they needed to allow a certain request for a period of time off during a day to meet a religious need. And in fact, they did need that. They did need to accommodate that person. Wasn't malicious, just didn't know. But again, I'm also not naive. I know there is a lot of malicious discrimination out there where people are being denied opportunities based on one of these 18 prohibited grounds. It can be, I can tell you, sitting around a table when we're making a decision to hire somebody, and somebody says we shouldn't hire them because they're a single mother, and they're, you know, every time the kid gets sick, they're not going to come to work. It's a very lonely place when you're the HR person that says that's not right. We can't do that. Legally, we can't do it. And more than anything, it's just not right to do. But those are some of the things that sometimes people make decisions on. And there can be other things which are just as worse as that based on some of these 18 prohibited grounds. The Ontario Human Rights Commission is obligated to investigate any complaint. They are what we call a quasi-judicial board. So they don't need a warrant. They can just show up at your workplace and start asking questions. Now, they don't always do that. Most of them will phone ahead of time and say, we've got this concern, and they want to talk it out with you, okay? My experience with them has been pretty positive in terms of when I've had to address employee concerns that they may have been discriminated against, okay? Part of educating people in the workplace on human rights is training. And part of this is around the workplace violence and harassment and sexual violence and harassment in the workplace training. That is mandatory training that you must give to employees, either, you know, in an in-person setting or a excuse me, or via PowerPoint. Now, here's the proviso. They only expect you to provide this training and have a program and policy in place if you have 5 or more employees. At the end of my slides, you will see a little snippet of a story that I posted up there about an employee that was the subject of harassment at a startup, and there was only 3 or 4 people working there. My recommendation is, you know, if don't count on the fact that you have less than 5 employees, that if this occurs in your workplace, that you're not going to be subject to some sort of consequence. So it's a good thing to find out a little bit more about this and perhaps do some training of your employees so that they know that what is acceptable in the workplace and what isn't. Workplace violence and harassment and sexual violence and harassment are covered under Ontario human rights as well as health and safety protocols as well. The reason I say workplace violence and harassment and sexual violence and harassment is that it's 2 different acts. In 2009, Bill 168 enacted workplace violence and harassment in the workplace. And then in 2016, there was an addendum, Bill 132, with sexual violence and harassment in the workplace. And there's no coincidence that it came in around the same time that Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. It was still happening anyways, but it was ironic that it was brought in as he was getting elected. So again, that's a piece of training that is mandatory if you have 5 or more employees. But again, even if you have less than that, it's my recommendation you get familiar with it. Employment Standards Act, or ESA, and I think I'm pretty confident in saying this is going to be something that most of you in where you're at with your employment size numbers, this is what is going to mostly pertain to you. So the Employment Standards Act is the minimum thresholds that employers must provide to to employees. And it doesn't matter if it's one employee or two employees. These are the minimum thresholds. This is just a snapshot of some things that need to be provided. So hours of work, eating periods, rest periods, you see the list there. I think we go through a few of these. It covers everything right up until if you terminate an employee, what are your obligations, or you have to have layoffs of an employee, something that is big right now because a number of employers have had to lay off employees given the COVID situation. And that actually created a bit of a kerfuffle because of some of the wording around temporary layoffs, which again, I will get into and entertain any questions if that comes up. So I think some of the pieces, I'll go through a few of these. So hours of work, eating periods, and rest period. After 5 hours of work, an individual is entitled to a half-hour unpaid eating period. Full stop, no two ways about it. Rest periods. Some employees may think that they are entitled to 2 15-minute breaks. In fact, they're not. That's not something an employer has to give. It is completely at their discretion. Most employers are happy to give it. Those periods are paid. So because they are paid periods, that means that the employee cannot go off site if that's what the employee wants. They must stay on site. With the unpaid eating period, the employee has the right to leave the workplace, and as long as they come back within their half-hour period of allotted time, they're fine, okay? Payment of wages, there must be a regular schedule of payment, which must be communicated to employees, and you must provide pay stubs. I had same client a few years ago in the travel industry, and as well as the independent contractor piece. He did have a few employees, and he'd been in business for a while, and he had not given a pay stub in his entire existence to employees. And again, just something he just didn't know he actually had to do that. But it is required by law that you give a pay stub to employees for every pay period. Overtime pay, it begins at 44 hours a week. Some employers, again, this is the minimum thresholds. Some employers go beyond the threshold, which is fine. As long as they don't go, they circumvent, then there is no, there's nothing wrong with that if you exceed the threshold. I should go back to hours of work and overtime while I'm talking about it. Under current legislation, an employee can work no more than 48 hours in a week. If the employer wants them to work more than 48, excuse me, they must make an application to the Ministry of Labor. And even then, the maximum an employee can work is 60. And I say that because, again, for some people, that's not a well-known fact. When you're talking about management, these provisions do not apply. If you are a manager, overtime provisions are not something that is afforded. And of course, if you're the owner or managing partner or whatever your term is in your connection with creating your dream organization, you're certainly not subject to these provisions either. With tips and gratuities, it's not an automatic, and I know that food is a part of what some of you are doing. I'm not sure if there's any restaurant type thing, or if your situation warrants that an employee would get tips and gratuities. Again, little known fact, it's not if an employee is given a tip, it's not their complete property. The employer can ask it be put in a company pot, and it can be divided up, okay? Again, not something that is always known by employers as well. Minimum wage, currently $14 an hour, although for some essential services workers, it's some have been given a $2 an hour wage increase, some have been given a $4. Again, I would assume most of you know that there is a minimum wage, and of course you can pay above that. The public holidays in Canada are New Year's Day, that you have to pay people for, and we'll get into a little bit more about that. New Year's Day, Family Day, Easter or Good Friday, Victoria Day in May, Canada Day, Labor Day in September, Thanksgiving Day, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day. So some employees sometimes have a belief that a couple of the other Easter holidays, like Palm Sunday and Easter Monday, are statutory holidays. They're not. Same with the civic holiday in August. That is not a employer guaranteed public holiday where you have to pay people for the day, basically. So they get public holiday pay. There are some provisions around that in terms of having worked your shift before and your shift after. If you are a business that you need your people to work on that day, they get a full 8 hours in lieu to take at a later time, and they work at time and a half. Public holidays and any overtime is paid at time and a half. You can ask your employees to take that in lieu time as opposed to getting paid for it, but that lieu time must also be given out at time and a half as well. So if the person works an hour extra, they get 1.5 hours in lieu to use at a later time. Okay. Vacation, minimum standard is 2 weeks or 4% in vacation pay. After 5 years, it is 3 weeks or 6% vacation pay. Beyond that, it is at the employer's discretion of how they dole out vacation. And usually, of course, with tenure, people move up on the vacation grid, and they get more vacation the longer they stay at a company. Termination of employment and temporary layoffs. And again, this is something that has been, especially the temporary layoffs. So termination of employment. If you are letting a person go and you are doing it without cause, so let me just, Cole's Notes version of for cause dismissal and just cause dismissal, or sorry, without cause dismissal. Just cause dismissal is you catch them doing things like stealing, or willful misconduct that is harmful to employees, like workplace violence and harassment, or there is enough there performance-wise that you can say you're not doing your job correctly, we're letting you go. What that means is that all you owe them is their outstanding wages and any vacation they've accrued up to that point. That's it. In a dismissal without cause, so you decide you no longer want or need this person for whatever reason, at a minimum, and I think I've mentioned this before, you owe them a week for every year they've worked there, up to a maximum of 8 years or 8 weeks, okay? The second element to this, which I believe in all of your cases would not be applicable given your employee size, severance provisions. You only have to provide severance. This is the threshold. You only have to provide severance if the employee has been with you for 5 years or more, and you have a $2.5 million Ontario payroll. Now, having said that, The reason employment lawyers are so busy, and the reason I have to have a lot of conversations with employment lawyers, is we have this thing called case law. And although it says in the Act, these are the standards, their case law is different circumstances that where the employee was let go, where they may be entitled to further monies. And so that may come up, okay? A person may challenge their circumstances of getting let go, even if you've done all the right things. Here's a statistic for you. In 80% of cases where an employee challenges the compensatory package they've been given for losing their job, they usually wind up with more, a little bit more, not a lot more, but a little bit more, okay? For some employers, it's a case of I'll negotiate with them and give them some money so that we can just move on from this. So just something to keep in your for your information. But again, having represented small to medium-sized employers when they've let an employee go for without cause, it is usually advisable to give them something outside of pay in lieu of notice. I had one case where the employee had been with them for 10 years plus. So to just give them 8 weeks didn't seem fair, even though it was the right thing to do, that this person needed to go. So we added another 6 weeks severance pay, and we called it in recognition of your long-term tenure here. We are giving you a further 6 weeks. That also accomplished another thing in that it didn't go any further than that. The employee was happy to receive 14 weeks, recognized that we were going above and beyond, and that was the end of it. So it's in some cases it's not a cookie cutter approach with terminations, and there are different facts that you have to take into consideration. Some of them may be the person's age, their tenure, as I've mentioned, as well as their ability to get a similar job in the geographic area where they live. We've got a couple of questions, so I'm just going to take a little bit of a break from the presentation to address these. So the question is around overtime for managers. If you are that generous of an employee, and excuse me, I'm just going to turn on a light behind me. That's better. If you are a generous employer and are paying your managers overtime, then it is completely up to you how you pay them, okay? And if I understand the question correctly, okay, I get this. This is a good point, and I should have mentioned this. Sometimes people feel that the overtime provisions only apply to people that are paid hourly. That is not correct. I know I've had clients in the past that have moved hourly employees to salaried employees, and they think that gets them out of paying overtime for any, for if they put out overtime. Non-management salaried employees are entitled to the same overtime provisions as any hourly non-management employee. So it doesn't matter if you're a non-manager employee, salaried or hourly. If they work overtime, they have to be compensated at time and a half. So obviously with the salaried employee, you just do the math to figure out how much they're making hourly and compensate them that way. So in the question here, if you're compensating your manager for overtime, again, you don't need to. It's great that you're doing it. But again, if you're paying them hourly, then it's the hourly rate that you use to figure out how much they're getting paid for overtime. The second part to this person's question was, if the employee quits, do I still need to give them severance pay? Employee resigns or quits, you do not owe them anything other than their outstanding pay and their vacation time. That's it. Severance and pay in lieu of notice, and I want to make clear that there is a distinction between these two pieces. Pay in lieu of if you are terminating an employee involuntarily, meaning they don't want to go, pay in lieu of notice applies to all employees. And again, that is a maximum of 8 weeks, 1 week for every year of service up to 8 years. Severance, the minimum threshold is have to have been with the organization for 5 years and an Ontario payroll of 2.5 million. But again, at least the clients I work with, even if they don't meet those thresholds and it's an involuntary separation, and depending on the circumstances, we give them a little bit extra to help in that transition to their next opportunity, okay? So no severance required other than if you're the one making the decision that the person's not working there anymore. Second question. Yeah, that is a very good question, and I'm sorry to it's often a question I get. It's about harassment, and if you go through the proper steps to go to your manager, if you went to HR. In this situation, what the person is asking me is they were harassed by a manager and a supervisor both, and HR does nothing. If the organization knows their stuff, and that sounds like a judgy statement, and I apologize for that. If they are on top of what their obligations are, I always try to put a positive spin on things. If they are on top of what their obligations are and in the know, if harassment is by a manager or a supervisor, it is in that organization's best interests to secure the services of an outside third party to investigate these claims. Part of the reason we had an addendum in 2016 with the advent of Bill 132 is that when they did some research or did an audit of complaints that were handled internally versus those that were referred outside, they were not comfortable with the amount of internal complaints that were deemed unsubstantiated. And they felt that a better mechanism was where the circumstances warrant, and specifically in the case where it's a manager or a supervisor being accused of harassment, it is best to get a third-party investigator from the outside. If in this situation, the Human Resources Department or the person they reported into did not do that or did not feel that they needed to do that, the person who feels they are a victim of this harassment can file a claim with the Ministry of Labor, and the Ministry of Labor will go in and investigate themselves or appoint a impartial third-party investigator. So I hope that answers your question. So we were still talking about termination of employment, and I'm just going to do how did we get to 8 o'clock already? Wow. I hope I'm not boring you. Termination of employment, I think we have, we've talked about that. Temporary layoffs. This has, as I've said, with COVID, this has become a real, I'll call it flashpoint. Again, within the legislation, the companies have the right to provide temporary layoffs where necessary. What has become the flashpoint is, and I go back to that employment contract again, is in some instances where it is not in the employment contract that one of the circumstances of a termination may be a temporary layoff. They've deemed it a void, and there's been some case law where employees that have filed claims because it wasn't in their employment contract, they didn't know it could happen, and they've been rewarded. So it is in, again, employers' best interest now to start inserting that there may be a need for temporary layoffs, as we've seen right now. With temporary layoffs, the threshold for that is 13 weeks in a 20-week period, but if you're still providing benefits, it's 35 weeks in a 52-week period. If you exceed those thresholds, it then becomes a permanent layoff. And then you get into pay in lieu of notice and any severance obligations if it is applicable. As I've said, 5 years, $2.5 million payroll. I think we've covered off what you need to know for that. Leaves. There are a multitude of leaves that are available. And again, this is all available on the Employment Standards website, which I believe I have at the end of the presentation. The common denominator with all of these leaves is that the employee has a right to them. The employer can ask for documentation and proof, of course, in most cases. Their job is protected so that when they take these leaves, which are of varying durations, their job is protected when they get back. The employer cannot fire them when they're on leave, cannot replace them with somebody else and tell them they don't have a job at the end of it. As long as the employee is providing the appropriate documentation, then again, the employer is under an obligation to protect that employee's job. It doesn't mean you can't restructure their job, because sometimes when a person goes off, the company restructures. And as long as it is not related or is a reprisal against the employee for taking that leave, then there isn't going to be a problem, okay? Record keeping, I've talked about. Enforcement and compliance. Much like the Ontario Human Rights Commission, this is a quasi-judicial piece where they can, they can come in and request to see your records and ask to speak to people and get a sense of what the practices are to make any decisions on whether you're in violation. They are proactive. All of these bodies that I talk about, including health and safety, they are proactive. They are out there doing blitzes to ensure that people are organizations are in compliance. And it doesn't matter, public, private, 2-person organization, 2,000-person organization. They are out there. Are they covering everybody? No. But they hope that they will get to people. And of course, if there is a complaint launched against your organization, you're kind of on a list, and they may make follow-up visits to see what your practices are to ensure the same thing isn't happening, okay? They can issue orders, they can issue fines, and now there's been a couple of situations, like for instance, a couple of restaurant owners in the GTA area, they didn't pay their employees and they closed up shop and they owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. They ignored all orders to compensate their employees. So in the end, criminal charges were filed and both of these people went to jail. So it is getting a little bit more serious in terms of some of the consequences of employers not complying with this. Okay. I'm just going to go through just in the interest of time, because we're halfway through the slides. Not employment standards. There are some industries that are exempt from some of these standards. Some of the, you see some of the examples there. Just to add to that, people that work in IT, there's some exemptions, like particularly with OT, overtime, I should say. I'll try not to use the HR acronyms. They are exempt, doesn't matter what level they're at, from overtime provisions. When in the construction industry, because there's a lot of turnover, a lot of people in that industry move from employer to employer. There are no severance obligations that are required if you are in the construction industry working a frontline construction job. So there's a whole list on the website, and there is a link there to see if the industry you're in is exempt from some of these and what that entails and what that means. Although this is from 2017, 2018, excuse me, this is still pertinent. Payment of wages, vacation pay, misclassification of vacation pay and vacation time, termination pay, public holiday pay, overtime pay. These were the biggest violations that they found, which were either reactive investigations and audits or by employee complaints, okay? Many of these, easy peasy to rectify. It could be a simple misunderstanding as well. An added piece here, and this is why the Employment Standards Act investigators are so proactive, is they did a follow-up check on 125 employers in the GTA that had been cited for different violations, many of them in this category. And they were very disappointed to find that out of that 125, 75 were still not compliant with what they had been cited for. So when you're an employment standard investigator and you're seeing things like this, you might get a little bit jaded in thinking that, is this what all employers are doing, just ignoring us? Hence the reason why they are somewhat, the proactive nature of the employment standards investigators, the health and safety investigators, this is only new in the last 5, maybe, I'd say last 5-10 years, okay? Prior to that, it was pretty much driven by employee complaints. So they are out there, and yeah, I've certainly heard from clients and non-clients, it'll never happen to me. And then lo and behold, surprise, surprise, they show up unannounced at their door. And, hopefully they are prepared, because again, it's all down to, let's see your documentation. Okay, so I think we went through most of this. Regular pay period, wage statements. Also to note, travel time, training time, and things like emails and texts outside of work, that is all compensatory time. So just, if the person is, if they leave their house to travel to a client's house, or sorry, client's business to do a sales call, that's not compensatory time. That's just, it would just be like going into work that day. It's just a different location. However, that time from the client's place back to the office, that's compensatory time. Or if they have to travel on a flight, that is also compensatory time as well. All right. And training time is all time that is has to be compensated as well. We've talked about vacation time and what that means. Termination pay, these are the pay in lieu of notice. By the way, folks, I just want to say I have given these slides to Nafis, and he is going to make them available for you. so that you can have them as a handy resource, okay? Public holidays, we've talked about what they are and what the employer's obligations are with them. Again, 9 public holidays, doesn't include the August long weekend or the Easter Sunday or Monday. You are entitled to take them off with public holiday pay, but if you have to work it, you get 8 hours in lieu, plus you get paid time and a half for the day that you work as well. So overtime, we've talked about this. And again, I didn't talk about lieu time and how long you have to use it. The employer can express that it must be used within certain timeframes, as you see there. Some are a little bit more generous. Generally, most want it used up before the end of the year. So, health and safety, and for some organizations, this is going to be the biggest onus of legislation upon you. And it doesn't matter whether you, and again, I've heard this from some clients that are more based in office settings like financial or something like that. It doesn't matter whether you are heavy manufacturing, industry, construction, factory setting, or office setting. Health and safety applies to every workplace, okay? What does vary is depending on the employee size. So at 5 employees, you need to have some health and safety rules. You need to have a health and safety representative, which is an employee representative who works with the management side to ensure that the workplace is safe. At 20 employees, you need a comprehensive health and safety program with a joint health and safety committee made up of an equal representation of frontline employees and managers, and there must be at least what we call 2 certified members. So those are one from management, one from the employee side, and they go off for special training so that they can do things like workplace investigations, work refusals, things like that. All members of a joint health and safety committee need to be trained in what their obligations and responsibilities are as part of that joint health and safety committee. At 50 employees, you need 2 employee reps and 2 management reps from from each side. You can never have more manager reps than employee reps, but you can certainly have more employees on the Joint Health and Safety Committee than managers. Just had a good question. It's one that has been coming up quite a bit given the COVID situation and people working from home. And the answer to that is yes, health and safety regulations, along with most other of these things I've been talking about, still apply in the work from home situation. So you as an employer, you should be going through with your employee safe working habits, making sure there are no obstacles. The only difference in this is whereas a Ministry of Labor an occupational health and safety inspector can come into the workplace at any time and inspect your workplace, they cannot come into a private residence and inspect. But you as the employer, excuse me, just going to take a sip. You as the employer have to educate your work from home employee that they need to maintain a safe working place. Particularly if they're sitting at a computer all day, you want to make sure that they have the right ergonomics. A lot of this can be done virtually. You can ask them to take their phone and just guide them through their working space so that you can see if there's any potential hazards. Again, The workplace is defined as where the work is being done and the person is in the act of employment. And that's certainly the case with work from home situations, okay? So I hope that adequately answers your question. It's a little bit tricky, not gonna lie about that, but there are ways that you can definitely ensure that your employees are still maintaining a safe work environment. If that means a virtual inspection of their workplace, then that has to be done. So when we talk about health and safety, it's not just the physical health and safety, it's the psychological health and safety as well. And this, of course, reflects on the workplace harassment and violence and other type of the mental health issues and psychological issues that could result from that. It also pertains to things like a toxic work environment. If the workplace is unfortunately that dysfunctional that people are, it's having a psychological impact on people, that needs to be addressed as well. It's only recently that Workplace Safety Insurance Bureau, which we'll talk about in the next slides, they have only just recently begun accepting claims of proven psychological injuries in the workplace. Prior to that, it was on a situation by situation piece. What I mean by that is if you are a gas bar attendant and you get robbed at gunpoint, that's pretty terrifying. That's psychologically impacting. So, hey, we expect you to take some time off from work before you return back. But now, if you can prove a pattern of psychological impairment or psychological harm, I should say, that is a result of the workplace and the behavior of employees, they will approve your claim, and that could be permanent. And I'll talk about what the impact is for the employer in that sense when I get into the WSIB phase. So health and safety, it's mandatory training like workplace violence and harassment. There's also on the Ministry of Labor website, there are 2 training programs. It's worker supervisor health and safety training. So there is one for a frontline employee and what they need to know about their rights in the workplace as it pertains to health and safety. And then there's one for supervisors, and it's what their obligations are as a supervisor overseeing health and safety in the workplace, as well as what their rights and duties and obligations are. So it is mandatory. I would say, a lot of these mandatory trainings like health and safety, within the first couple of days before the person's even on the floor, they should be getting these taken care of so that you can meet your obligation. WSIB, which again stands for Workplace Safety and Insurance Bureau. Most, but not all employers are required to be a part of WSIB. This is the arm where it's the compensatory arm where, and again, if you know this, just bear with me. If an employee gets hurt at work, this is the area where they will receive compensation for any time off that is the result of a workplace accident or injury. As I said, most employers pay into it. They pay based on their industry, and it is a percentage of their employee payroll amounts. It is totally employer funded. The employee pays nothing into this system. It's a no-fault insurance system. It's one of the oldest systems, the one in Ontario, it's one of the oldest systems of workplace insurance bureaus in the world. And even if the employee is injured as a result of their own of their own, it's their own fault, they didn't take the proper safety protocols, they're not concerned with that. They still, the person will still be compensated for their time off, for their injury. And if in fact it was a performance issue that they didn't abide by health and safety regulations, then it is addressed through the performance and disciplinary process, if that's the case. WSIB also pays for healthcare specialists, and if it gets to a point where the person cannot return to their pre-injury job, then WSIB will pay for them to get vocational retraining, so training for another industry. So again, that is WSIB in a nutshell. If you're not sure if you are one of those exempt industries, again, there is a website which talks about it. Some industries can opt in. It's not mandatory. However, you have to ask yourself the question, what are you going to do if your employee gets hurt at work and it comes back on you? With WSIB, what this also means is that your employee cannot sue you if they get hurt at work, because we have this system in place. So if you're not paying into WSIB and you don't have any other kind of insurance coverage, then you could be liable if your employee gets hurt at work and it is found to be something you did or did not do. Sorry, just down it. AODA. AODA stands for Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It is a mandatory training even if you have one employee. The type of training that you have to provide, which is across the board, no matter your employee size, is what we call the customer service standard. And that is a training on what you need to do when you have customers or clients that have some form of disability. And it trains you on the different types of disabilities, service dogs, equipment like wheelchairs, and how to provide, and basically it's ensuring that your employees are providing the same level of customer service to a person with a disability, either one that is visible or not visible, as they would any, quote, able-bodied person. There are other types of obligations that you have under this act that again depend on your employee size and your physical location. Accessibility, if you are building a new location, you have to ensure that there is full accessibility for people with disabilities. Even in some places where accessibility may be an issue, you may be required to adjust your building so that it is accessible. It may mean something as like the installation of an elevator. It may also talk about your recruitment practices and what you provide to people with disabilities if they are going through the recruitment process. Again, accommodation. What accommodation is, what can you do so that if a person has a disability and it impacts their ability to do the job in some way, but they can still do the core elements, what can you do to accommodate that person? For instance, it may mean if a person is sight visually impaired, there are computers available which can help those types of people. Interestingly enough, one of the things that has come out of this is that some employers that have pushed back on hiring employees with disabilities and having them work in remote locations, saying it's not feasible. Well, with all of this remote work from home, there is a perception out there that that argument has been debunked. So it'll be interesting to see when all this ends, and it is going to end, what that transpires into more opportunities for people with disabilities if we're going to allow people to work from home. There's a lot more to AODA, which may or may not apply to you, depending on your employee size. The full phase-in is scheduled for 2025, and by that time, it will have been a 20-year project in the making. This was first enacted into law in 2005, so it'll be a long slog. I've worked in this quite a bit over the years, and some employers find this a cumbersome piece of legislation, but I've worked in it so much I don't see it as that cumbersome. Required postings, you are required to, and these are easily attainable by the various websites. There's an employment standards poster, which outlines what the employment, some of the employment standards are that are important that employees should know. With every new employee, they should actually be getting a copy of this poster so that they have it to read. That is a relatively new thing that has been enacted. Usually it just needed to be posted in the workplace. There needs to be a couple of health and safety posters there. What to do in case of an injury is one of them. And that prevention poster, which you see posted there. Again, some of these things are dependent on your employee size after we get past the in case of injury poster. If you are at 20 employees, you need a health and safety board that outlines the members of the Joint Health and Safety Committee, a copy of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We call it the Little Green Book. It is the basic manual for health and safety in Ontario. There are a number of different other green books that are specific to industries like mining, oil and gas, construction. You must also post the results of any inspections, which are to be conducted at a minimum once every 3 months, or sorry, once a month. Any meetings of the Joint Health and Safety Committee must be, the minutes must be posted. Those must occur at a minimum once every 3 months. There must be a commitment to occupational health and safety signed by the owner, the president, the CEO. That should be posted as well. And also your workplace violence and harassment policy, that should be a part of all your policies and procedures. And again, another statement on your AODA commitment as well. So, power. We've talked about this. The Ministry of Labor, which encompasses Employment Standards Act and Occupational Health and Safety Act, those inspectors are what we call quasi-judicial. So they don't need a warrant. They don't even need to tell you that they're coming in. They can, in one instance, a health and safety inspector was driving on his way home, saw a manufacturing facility that he'd never inspected before and decided, I'm going to give him a visit. Now, fortunately, that turned out okay. It was a past client of mine, but that's the type of thing that can happen, okay? Typically, in both cases, they don't want to speak to the people in charge right away. They want to speak to your employees because they want to know how well you've trained them, if they know what their rights are in both instances, and to see if the practices are actually in place. Then they'll want to see your business records. And as I said, they can issue compliance orders, fines, and at the extreme level, which is very rare, there can be some real serious court proceedings as well. So I can't give you the statistics on how many inspections are as a result of complaints to the different legislative bodies versus reactive audits. But the power, there is power within the employee. So that's not to say that every employee complaint is valid. And further to that, they don't have to give their name in some cases when they're making a complaint. They can make it an anonymous complaint. You know, you can have an opinion about that, but it is what it is. But they, you know, they may contact any of these bodies and say, this is what happened, and I think you should go in and check them out. And these bodies are obligated to check these out. With the Canada Revenue Agency, that's a bit more of a serious thing. And I don't think they can report that one anonymously at all. They, as I've said, they may retain an employment lawyer. You get a disgruntled employee who you gave chance after chance to, and they still didn't get it for whatever reason. You follow your due process, and they still retain an employment lawyer. And like I said, in 80% of cases, you know, where a terminated employee challenges their severance package, they usually get some more, a little bit more, sometimes a lot, depending on what it is. They may, you know, as much as we build things in when we're separating from terminated employees that they can't disparage us, they may still do it. And even in cases where they're still working for you, they may be that disgruntled, legitimately or otherwise, and they may, you know, badmouth you to current employees and on social media. And yes, there are things in place that you can say, you can't do that, and if you continue to do it, there's going to be consequences, but sometimes the damage is already done. So, you know, if you as the employer follow what you're supposed to do, you minimize any risk to you, you set yourself up as a fair and transparent employer, and your employees are going to be much happier with that. If they know that everybody is getting treated equally, they're going to feel a lot more confident in you as an employer, for sure. So. Mismanaging staff, I'm just going to do a time check here. Unclear or unrealistic expectations. That's why we have job descriptions. That's why we have policies and procedures. All of the documentation that is required, so that there is something to refer to when we say these are our expectations. Micromanagement. Some of us become entrepreneurs because we've been micromanaged in the past. Just saying. So you don't want to make, you know, have your employees feel like they're under the gun all the time. You need to give them some autonomy as much as possible, but also realistically. Make sure I go back to the orientation, inadequate training and support. Make sure that you have done a comprehensive training, set out a training plan. Not managing staff relationships. So again, ensure that you're in constant communication. This is one of the key things I also hear when I am working with employees of my clients is they don't feel there's enough communication. So, you know, there are some things that, quite frankly, they don't need to know and they're not entitled to know. But give them what they need to know so that they can feel like they're a bigger part of the company and are, you know, that their opinion matters and their input matters. So, you know, obviously it's easy for me to say, you know, if you are knowledgeable in HR and can do this, then all the more power to you. That's great. If you feel you have the knowledge to get this all set up and do it, by all means. And some of you maybe even be lucky to have a friend or family member who will give you some freebie HR advice. But again, your needs at this point might be minimal for HR, just the real basics, but you should really ensure that they are, that it is exactly what you need. And as you grow, just keeping on top of what you need. There are some free resources, some websites. Some business or employment lawyers are glad to give you a half hour free of their time if you have any questions. And there's also, of course, webinars like this where you can get some information. But doing a plug for my industry, having an HR professional at your disposal in some capacity, well, it's cheaper than a lawyer, I can tell you that. And I'm going to be quite confident in saying, with my experience here and with my team's experience, we're better than lawyers. We are a regulated industry. There is a code of conduct. It's just like an accountancy. We can lose our designation if we have misconduct or don't act accordingly within the guidelines and parameters and ethics. We can bring so much to the workplace. I often sum HR up in the following 4 statements. It's to contribute to the organization, getting the right people at the right time, in the right place, with the right resources. And a question just popped up, so I'm just going to. These slides are going to be available to you. I believe Nafis is going to make them available, either emailing them out or in some other capacity. So you will have them. But there is a lot. And, you know, I guess one of the things that sometimes I find surprising is people will definitely go and hire an accountant because they know I don't have that expertise in most cases. But when it comes to HR, people get a little bit, either they don't feel, again, it goes back to those reasons, they may not know how much there is that is required, or they just feel they don't need it. I would say, you know, just as much as an accountant, an operations manager, you need your HR infrastructure as well. When I was, again, I go back to talking about when I was in HR boot camp, a professor then, who I am still in contact with, said, being in HR is the closest you'll ever come to practicing law without being a lawyer. And I have to say, he's proven to be right. A lot of what we do is guided by so much legislation that you have to be in the know on it. But we also do things to make organizations fun places to come into, good places to come into, to make it a what we call a high-performing culture, where employees are engaged in their work and motivated and inspired. And when you have all those things in a row, your turnover is low. You are able to retain employees. When you go out to recruit, it is easy peasy because your reputation precedes you. We're not all about coming into a department and then everybody thinks that somebody's getting fired that day. Yeah, that is a part of our job. It's an unfortunate part of our job, but we also are contributors to the well-being of an organization so that it is a place that people want to come and work at. So I've inserted in here, you know, what could potentially happen if you don't have the right HR things in place. So, you know, again, there was a startup with no HR department and dealing with sexism. Yeah, the question is, what can the person do to make sure their HR practices are top notch when I hire employees? You know, well, I'll just speak to what we do. Because your question, you know, sometimes we get a question in that similar vein, but it's something like this. I think I need some HR help I think I need some people to look at my HR. I'm not sure where to start. I don't know what I need. So my organization, we conduct what's called HR audits or HR benchmarks. So we have our checky boxy list that we go in with us and say, do they have that? Do they have that? Do they have that? Do they have that? And that gives us a good starting point to come back and say, here's where you're okay. Here's where you might need some best practices, or in some cases, some mandatory things put in place so that you have the right HR infrastructure as well. So that's where we always start when we get that type of question. Again, the next few slides are just some headlines I took. You know, where you don't want to see your company in the headlines, okay? And I go again. This is an extreme because, you know, most times that there is an issue where an employer may not have done what they're supposed to, it doesn't end up in the newspaper. But of course, you don't want to take that chance. And again, I don't try to take a fear-mongering approach or a thou should have, thou shalt have, and if you don't, they'll be held to pay. That's not my style. Simply put, I am here, as I have been for this presentation, to give you the best advice, guidance, and counsel that is necessary to have the appropriate HR infrastructures given your circumstances, and to let you know, there could be consequences if you don't have them. But outside of that, it is not my place to make the decision for you to say, you have to have that. That's up to you to say, I think I need to move forward with that, and protect yourself. So that concludes the presentation. I'm going to leave my contact information here. And again, you're going to get a copy of these slides. So, and thank you again for your attention. I love these sessions. It doesn't matter how big of a company I get to deal with. I always come back to, I love, and I said this to Nafis at the beginning, I love the power and the passion of startups and small business. And I always appreciate when I'm able to be along for your journey. So good luck to all of you. And again, stay safe.